Hello, movie lovers. Welcome home. My name is Amy Hinserling, and you are listening to Watch This List. This is a very special episode of PROVOCAUTEUR, in which Jetta and I will be analyzing perhaps the most fun provocateur. I think that he's definitely provocative, but he's also very silly, because the ones that Fassbender is not silly, Simon Lang is not silly, but Ken Russell, I feel like we are just going into like the deep end here. What do you think about that, Jenna? I think he's my silliest one yet.
Oh, I don't know if silly is the word. Colorful. Let's say colorful.
Okay, colorful.
He's got so many different shades in the rainbow. There you go.
There you go. And he's very maybe I mean silly by the spirit. Like a lot of his movies feel like they're like I don't know. I don't want to say irreverent, even though they are, but it's more just like fun and childish almost at times, especially when it's like, I don't know. I'm thinking of The Boyfriend. So
I have a quote that fits that. Oh my God.
Oh, I knew you were going to do this. Go ahead.
He said, "People are still reluctant to believe that artists are often kids at heart."
There you go. That's what I mean. Yeah. He's like, he feels to me a lot of times like a kid on the playground who has like chalk and is like writing on the concrete.
Yeah, definitely.
And like just designing his own things and doing his own things.
Yeah, I think he wanted so much to make a name for himself and to push the boundaries as far as he could that he figured, I've got all the crayons in the crayon box. Let's just color it all in.
Well, and I should preface this by saying, so Jetta, unbeknownst to me until I think yesterday or a couple of days ago, Jetta actually read his autobiography in prep for this, which is crazy. So you know way more than I do. But I wanted to say also, so I think that will add a very interesting element, because it's not just that we're talking about his films and it's not just that we're talking about him as director, but you know a lot more about his internal dialogue and what he was going after, which I find extremely interesting.
Oh, yeah. And the fact that he named his autobiography after my least favorite of all his movies, and the one I think you love the most, Altered
That's
States.
Right. Altered States. You know what is so weird about that? Because I thought when you'd written this in someone's thread, or it might have been yours, where you said, "Oh yeah, I'm reading the Ken Russell autobiography, Altered States." And that day I had ordered Altered States by Patty Chayefsky. How do you say his last name?
Patty Chayefsky.
Chayefsky. I had just ordered his actual book that he based the movie on. So we're just on like completely different wavelengths, but also a similar one. I thought that was hilarious.
Well, that experience for him, for Ken, it was hilarious. He hated Patty Chayefsky. Oh,
I know, and
God.
He hated him too. I think that's like a clash of like two very obstinate, stubborn people.
Huge clash of egos, and Patty Chayefsky essentially wanted to direct the movie himself. He would constantly pull the actors away off the set and ask them, "So what's Ken telling you? What's he directing?" and try to redirect the direction. So it was just destined to be a huge mess.
A disaster.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that was also Ken's first American movie, right? I'm pretty sure.
Well, it might be the first movie set in America. He'd certainly worked with American studios before to distribute movies. But yeah, I guess, Valentino is set in America.
No, I mean like where Hollywood. He worked in America to make the movie is what I mean. I'm almost positive I read that.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, I guess most of the other things were shot in England. So yeah.
And it was also William Hurt's first film, which is so interesting to me because he's very himself in it. Okay, we won't talk about this right now.
Can I just tell you, William Hurt apparently would never stop talking. He would never shut up, and it drove Ken Russell crazy. Like, he couldn't take William Hurt out to dinner. He would just yap and yap and yap and yap.
That's completely his character, though. That's Eddie. Like, that's exactly how Eddie is.
That sounds exhausting. But okay.
Yeah. Well, I will say this before we move on to actually starting in order. One thing I love about Altered States, in which I think Ken Russell sort of did this because I read about their kind of feud, and then that he basically like made sure that he wasn't on the set, and then Patty didn't even put his real name in the credit. He put like his two middle names as his name, and then it said based on the novel by Patty Chayefsky.
Right,
and
Sidney
Aaron. And then what I was going to say was that Russell was so like angry about the situation that he had the characters say the lines very fast, like in rebellion to Patty. So there's a lot of times in the movie where like they're talking and they're eating, like their mouth is full and they're like saying the lines. I just think that's so petty, but hilarious. And it doesn't take away from it at all. I think it's great. I love the dialogue. So,
well, that brings us to the interesting question in doing this episode of how do you feel about Ken Russell when you tend to gravitate toward movies that you would describe as less Ken Russell-like? I don't know that that's always true, because there are things in the less extreme movies that are still very Ken Russell to me. Like The Rainbow is not gratuitous in the way that, say, Listomania is, but it still feels like a Ken Russell statement. It still feels like something he wanted to say in his filmmaking.
I totally agree with you. I think that you're right. It's more just it's
restrained.
It's a subtle difference.
Yes.
Like I think that you, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like you like the more of Ken Russell, and I like the under constraints, more refined, maybe at Ken Russell.
Sure. I mean, I do love The Rainbow. I thought that was incredibly effective. I think for me, depends on how I connect to the characters. It depends on what I feel is being told effectively, because I really like Savage Messiah, and I know that you weren't so hot on it. That's a restrained one for him. That's not. I
agree
wild.
with you. I agree with you. And Jatavio told me that I would love that one, and I think I had just watched. What did I had just watched before that? It might have been The Boyfriend, because it was something that was crazy, and then I was like, oh, I'm really looking forward to Savage Messiah. But I think what happened with Savage Messiah is, I liked it a lot the first half. Like, I thought the way they met each other, I was like, oh my gosh, am I going to give this 5 stars? Like, it was so good. Like, the dynamic, I loved how annoying he was towards her. You know, like, he kept like pushing her, and then she would respond. They had like a great rapport about them. But it just, I think it kept going and going at that like level where I couldn't, it's like the whole thing is yelling, and I wanted some ups and downs instead of just well, I don't know, what do you think about it?
I mean, granted, I didn't rewatch it, but I do remember how much I appreciated both the intensity of the performances, because I think both Scott Anthony and Dorothy Tootin are so terrific, and I think it's really a shame that Scott Anthony didn't really have a career. He either couldn't get roles or chose not to, and then just left the business. And Dorothy Tootin was mainly a character actress, so this was a kind of rare lead role for her to have that much of a presence on screen. And so I appreciated that, and I appreciated how they dug into those characters. And also Helen Mirren is great.
Helen Mirren.
Votes for women. I love that.
Good grief. Well, and she's just completely naked at some point, and if that's not a selling point to, I mean, I thought this is worth it just for that, because she's so, it's not just that she's naked and she looks great. She's very, like, the way she carries herself is inspiring. It's like, I
feel like that's a story I really connect to emotionally, because the ending is so powerful. I'm thinking about, I guess Ken Russell's feelings on war, because obviously that's a very anti-war statement, the horror of World War I, the tragedy of all those lives lost. I feel like that's a very impactful moment in that film, but granted, Henri Gauthier-Breschke, as he's portrayed in the film, is just so unlikable. He's so difficult. He's such a problematic character because of the way he treats people, specifically women. So
he's kind of a brat, but he's like an artist brat, so you kind of like him still at the same. You know what I mean?
You're supposed to give him leeway in the same way you would give Ken Russell leeway, and I'm sure that's why he connects to that figure in history. He loves the outsider. He loves the artist who does what he needs to do no matter what, and doesn't care about the naysayers. And that's essentially what Ken had to do through his career.
Well, and I think he also really loves women who are very confident, like Glenda Jackson. I mean,
there's another quote.
Go ahead. And then I'll keep my thought. I'll hold on to my thought.
In discussing women in love, he said, "It's the film of mine that people regard most highly. Oddly enough, I'm not of the same opinion, but why pick my own work apart to pieces when there are plenty of others around to do it for me?" And he especially loved working with Glenda because, in my opinion, well, he goes also into talking about Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed also should have received an Oscar for daring to act opposite Glenda, who has eaten lesser men alive.
Truly, I had no idea who she was before this, and I was so... I mean, we started with Dante's Inferno, which was great, but then Women in Love was next, and she just blew me away. And I think that sort of set my mind at noticing when strong women were in the movies in his filmography, and they really are until the very end. Even Lair of the White Worm, you just feel like they have this very strong sense of agency, presence. Not only that, though, their sexuality in a funny way in Music Lovers, but we'll get to that. But yeah, starting with Women in Love and Oliver Reed. Jetta, I'm sad that he went away. Like, I thought that he was in more films, and I was looking so much forward to it, and then he never came again once I got away from, I think.
Well, he does pop up in Listomania.
Well, yeah,
but still, yeah, he actually did. He did work with Ken Russell again. Well, there's Tommy, of course, with his terrible singing, but of course, he did work again with Ken Russell in 1991 on a TV movie called Prisoner of Honor, but I don't think that's very highly regarded. So
yeah. Oliver Reed in Women in Love and Dante's Inferno is just like, oh my gosh.
He's a force of nature.
He is. I'll start like blushing if I talk too much about him.
That's what we should put. We should make this the focal point of the episode. What did you think of the nude wrestling scene? Please give us your thoughts.
Okay, somebody wrote this on one of my threads, and I was like, you know what? I didn't actually think that was super provocative because it seemed like something that they would do, the characters, like very naturally. Because, what is it, Alan Bates? Alan Bates at the beginning seems like a very fluid guy, very curious, very open. I do like how in that and The Rainbow, and maybe another one, where when people are with same-sex characters, it's like not even addressed. Like it's completely just like, oh, okay, we're doing this and nobody thinks anything of it. That's a very unusual quality to a movie, like especially The Rainbow. I felt like it was just like she wasn't questioning, why do I like this person? There was nothing, no internal nothing. And I kind of appreciated that, actually.
Yeah, I think what makes Women in Love so interesting with that scene is really not whether or not the characters would do it, but more like Ken Russell is pushing the bounds of what's acceptable in a movie that's going to be distributed mainstream. Right. So having that in a movie, which, in 1969, the world was like just on the precipice, at least America was on the precipice of allowing pornography in movie theaters. And that was going to be a major part of the movie-going experience for a lot of people. So it is interesting to think of, that's also the year of Midnight Cowboy, the year of movies that are rated X, even though they're not really X, but it's just like, they're so scandalous, they're so controversial, it's like being X, as far as people are concerned for mainstream. So yeah, I think it's more like the salaciousness, not necessarily whether or not it makes sense, because I think it does.
I think it actually does in the narrative, and I think that if there's like two separate questions, if like it wasn't provocative to me at this juncture, because I've seen so many things, but is it provocative for the time? Yes. That's like, and especially for the setting that the movie itself is in. But it just kind of reminded me of Gothic. I don't know. I felt like, I was like, oh, this could totally have been a scene in Gothic, and it would have made absolute sense. And it was kind of around the same, everybody's talking and looks the same and is dressing the same as that.
Oh yeah. He also devotes very little time to Gothic in his memoir. Like at that point, toward the end of the book, he's moving chronologically. So it's like, I'm not going to waste time talking too much about the mid to late 80s. I'm going to just go right to The Rainbow. So Gothic gets maybe a page. And the only thing he really says of note is that, wow, I was making a movie about British characters in England. Like, this was such a shocking thing. I guess he had such a reputation for wanting to travel outside of England, wanting to tell more global stories. Maybe he was thinking of Listomania, Valentino being kind of more pulling from all different cultures. I don't know. I guess he thought, maybe people thought he couldn't do a British movie, quote unquote. So.
Oh no, I think that is, yeah. I think Gothic also sort of paved the way for him because it was like a surprise hit, right? So he got like a 3-picture deal from that just because it was actually successful, which he didn't. I don't think that he really was doing it for anybody except himself. There was a quote I read that was like, he knew that the critics didn't like him and he didn't care. And he just had these obsessions. Like he had things that he wanted to say and the way that he wanted to say them. And thankfully he got actors around him who were willing to be down for it.
Yeah. And I think that when he was given ideas for projects or options to do projects that probably would have been more financially successful than some of his other flops at the time, through the 70s and 80s, he was so difficult with wanting to do exactly what he wanted to do and not wanting to compromise that he would give up on things that could have been successful for him. Like he was going to do an Evita adaptation, which of course eventually would have Madonna in it. At the time, there was a suggestion Barbara Streisand might do it, which would be wild. I think she was busy doing Yentl. Then he wanted Liza Minnelli. He really, really wanted Liza. I don't know that would have made any sense, but he wanted her so badly, and the producers wanted the Broadway star Elaine Page, and Ken was adamant he didn't want her, and the producers wanted her anyway, and so he was never going to move forward with that. So he probably could have had chances to make more success, more money, but he just wanted so much to stick to his guns and do things even when they were not popular. So or that's admirable.
Just didn't make any sense. Like I read that for Salome's Last Dance, she was blind, right? The girl, the actress was like sick and had like an infection, and he just insisted that she be the character, even though you can tell in the movie. I wouldn't say the whole time. I'm not going to be too harsh on her because I think she did a good job. But a lot of the movie, you can see that she can't see, and it's kind of bizarre. It gives it a weird air to it that wouldn't have been there if he had just picked someone who wasn't, I don't know. She was almost compromised in that way.
Well, I'm not sure if he was the person pushing for her to be in it so much as I read that she really wanted to do it and she pushed herself to show up, and she wanted to be like the professional coming anyway and sticking through it. I do think it adds an interesting quality, and I've seen other reviewers mention this, the fact that she's always kind of, staring and opening her eyes, and it's like she can't even see, and it's part of like this intense gaze. That adds a certain interesting quality to it, because a lot of it, I mean, the whole character is about, look at me, look at this, look at everything I am. Exactly. And so she has this difficulty and this intensity that I think kind of meshes with it in an interesting way.
I agree completely. It was the movie that I thought that I'd be literally offended by, and I wasn't, because I felt like, well, this could sort of address what you said earlier about me liking things that are less Ken Russell-y. Like, since this was almost, I think he said it was like word for word Oscar Wilde, I felt more at ease with the theatrics because the dialogue was so enriching. I mean, it was so full, and I felt like Oscar Wilde was doing the story justice in a way that wasn't trying to belittle the story. Whereas Listomania, I was like, man, I can't get on. I can't feel this movie or connect to it in any way, because there's just there's no like accessible point for me. Does that make any sense? I don't know if that makes sense.
I think it may depend on your personal connection. Like, if you already have an interest in a story or a person, I really want to describe. I really want to say Salome's Last Dance, because that's how they say it in the movie, and I don't know if that's a British thing. But it's very funny that it sounds like salami. Very Ken Russell. Yeah. If you're already interested in that story, I think that might also help. And if you approach Listomania not knowing about List or not being quite so interested in, I mean, whether or not it's historically accurate, who really cares?
I don't think he's going for historical accuracy. Yeah,
there is some degree in there. There are some things baked in, but if you're interested in it, it'll be interesting to you. And if it feels less accessible and if you're not drawn into the style, the substance, because I would argue there is substance with the style. I don't think it's all just flash. I think that there is something being said in Listomania. Again, it's like an anti-war thing. I mean, it's about ultimately good versus evil. It's really not even about the music. The music is kind of like the way to tell the message. So, I think he would just... I lost my train of thought, which is very Ken Russell. But
what is it exactly? Because, okay, one of the reasons I wanted to do Ken Russell with you specifically is because of how many of his films you've given 5 stars to. Like that was one of the things that I said to Zach. I was like, what's the director that you've given the most 5-star ratings to? And she was like, Fassbinder. So I was like, we're doing that, because I know that means that you love his work and that you can appreciate it in a holistic way, not just like I liked 1 or 2. So for you, I think it's Tommy that you did 5 stars to, The Rainbow you just did, I think Listomania maybe, and definitely The Boyfriend. So do you feel like there's a common thread between these, or are they completely their own things in your brain and you just connect to different things with each of them?
Well, I think some of the movies are different enough that it really feels like they're standing apart, even when they have Russell-esque tendencies. Like, I don't see that Tommy is necessarily exactly like, drumroll please, Crimes of Passion.
Oh, I forgot. That's probably another $5 for you.
It is.
Okay.
That's
I
actually
what that one.
That's actually
and Lair of the White Worm you just gave 5 stars. This is definitely
exactly.
Yeah, this is up there for you, I think.
Yeah. I think those are all the 5 stars. But yeah, I think that with each of those films, even when they're telling their stories in different ways, like The Boyfriend, that's also its own certain contained thing, I just respond so strongly to the way the story is being told, to the tendency for him to. I mean, this is not true of some of his films in the 80s, I think. Not true of Crimes of Passion, but he'll repeat casts. He'll use the same people over and over. There's a feeling, like Fassbinder, of getting used to seeing the same people in these films. It's a very comforting kind of thing. You know, you see Glenda Jackson in a lot of films. You see Christopher Gable. You see Oliver Reed. You see people, let's even include Roger Daltrey. You see all these people who you get used to, and it's nice. There's a nice feeling to that. And so I can use that to get into why I love the films. And when I think about the themes that he loves using, obviously he loves approaching sexuality, religion, hypocrisy, societal rules, and people who break those rules. There are all these interesting things that I think you see across the filmography.
The Devils is another one. I think that's another 5-star for you.
There you go.
Jetta. It's great. I just love, that's partly what I was thinking during The Boyfriend. It was so not connecting with me, but then I thought I loved reading about the people for whom connected with it. Like the energy and the spirit of this. It was almost like, yeah, this like exhausted me, but I can't wait to watch it again. That was really the crux of it. And I thought, I don't know if I feel that way about any movie, but this is obviously a very special thing when it works.
I think so. There is a feeling like if you gravitate to directors who would be described as more provocative, there is such an admiration, a respect for where they're willing to go and how far they're willing to push acceptability for that time, and even feel like it's pushing bounds now. I think there are people who would watch The Devils now and realizing that it would have been considered controversial in 1971 can also feel that now. Like they would look at it and be like, whoa, you still couldn't make that movie today. That would still be a problem. And that would still create all these conversations and Twitter wars, I'm sure. So it would be fascinating, you know, to think about that in terms of how we move forward in history. It is still controversial. It is still scandalous.
Right.
It's pretty interesting, pretty cool.
Well, and for The Boyfriend, what you had me do, which I thought really was helpful in terms of understanding it better when I was watching it, was I watched 42nd Street prior to that, which helped. I think it helped most with the backstage energy. And that's why I also thought of Topsy Turvy, because that's a lot of backstage, you know, energy and sort of how are we going to put on this show as opposed to just watching the show. So how do you see those two relate? Because I don't think The Boyfriend it wasn't like a remake or anything of 42nd Street, but you connected them yourself, right?
Yeah, well, there are literal, he's pulling from, so essentially the original play, the musical, The Boyfriend, is just what you see being done in the show within the show. If Ken Russell had adapted the piece as it was, it would have just been what we see on the stage, but he decided to create a framework around that to give it this backstage musical aspect, like a Busby Berkeley musical. So then you actually get to know the characters who are playing the characters, and you see the struggles of this theater to make ends meet and to feel like what they're doing is worth it, even though there's nobody in the audience except that director, basically, who they're all trying to vie for the attention of. I think that, you know, this brings up an interesting question of, I think that it's useful to see 42nd Street beforehand because there are, you know, things pulled from it, like you're going out there a youngster, but you're coming back a star. That's taken right from 42nd Street. That same idea is copied for Twiggy's character. And also Peggy, Polly, it's the same thing. Falling in love with the lead and, you know, happily ever after. It's really one of his most cheerful endings. I mean, people are happy at the end.
It's shocking.
Yeah, like that's charming. But, you know, there's a question of, do you love that he is being so literal and taking so strongly from Busby Berkeley to the point of copying that? Because it's, I think, a loving homage. Or do you watch that with the context? Because I thought it was important to share that context, because I think a lot of people watching The Boyfriend at the time would have been familiar with the inspiration. So they would have gone into it knowing that. And there was also kind of a Busby Berkeley musical revival at the time in the early 70s. So people were definitely thinking about it. But do you feel like that hurts the movie to know that it copies so much? Do you think it's less original and therefore less, because you really, really didn't like The Boyfriend? So
I didn't, and I felt so bad, Jetta, because I was like, I read your review and you were talking about how nostalgic it was for you, like that you watched it as a kid,
yes.
like and that you connected with it, and I understand how you could do that. I think that it's the constantness of it and how long it is that way. It's the same way I felt with Russellmania and Savage Messiah to a certain extent, where it's just in your face relentlessly. And if you don't like it, it's like eating too much of something you don't like. Like, even if it's sweet, let's say, like it's ice cream, but it's just too much ice cream. Honestly, I thought of Wes Anderson. And I thought to myself, through this Ken Russell marathon, like watching him back to back to back to back to back, I was like, I will never do Wes Anderson for this podcast ever, because I think that it would sour his strengths, because it's not the same thing over and over again, right? But it's with
Wes it is, yeah.
With Wes, but I mean, if you watch one, you can appreciate the aesthetic so much more richly than if you keep going. That's how I felt with The Boyfriend, where it was just too much of a good thing, maybe too much of a creative thing, and there was no relaxation from it, but that's the point of it. So I just,
Well, I definitely think that's true with Listomania, because there is no room to breathe in that movie.
Right.
But with The Boyfriend, it's such a long movie, isn't it? Like,
I know.
I didn't rewatch it yet, but it's 2.5 hours, right? There's a lot of time to spend with those characters. So I feel like there is more downtime, more time when you're just backstage getting to know them. Right. It's a little less hectic at times compared to Listomania, where it's just like throwing everything at the wall. So I think The Boyfriend gives you a little more space.
It is, but I guess maybe it's when it doesn't, it's just too much. It's just too much. It's like too much, the movie. Like,
but you have to like that. You have to enjoy.
Exactly.
Because when you see the costumes, credit to Shirley Russell for doing those, all the costumes and the sets and the makeup and the music, I think it does have wonderful music. The musical numbers that copy 42nd Street, like the one on stage with all the Koreans and the record, and like that is so enjoyable if you already love the Busby Berkeley underpinning and you love that style and you love seeing it again. And I think it also helps I've seen it on the big screen. So when you've seen it in the theater, it's like, oh, this is great. This is so bigger than life. It is just so exciting to see. I think maybe it does lose some of that appeal on a TV or anything smaller than that. So
it's also that if I saw it with you on the big screen, this would be a completely different experience.
Okay, so that's true.
A lot of this is, once you get down into why didn't I like this, it gets very complex, because it's also could be mood. It could be that I watched it and I had just watched 4 before that, and I was,
true.
So, but I'm just saying, like, I think, let me say this: The Boyfriend, while I'm saying that's too much, I have in my head saying that The Music Lovers is way too much. And for some reason, I really liked The Music Lovers. And I think maybe the difference is the musical part in The Boyfriend seemed grating, whereas in Music Lovers, because it's classical and because it reminded me of Possession, it reminded me so much of Possession that I just, once I thought that, I was like, I'm just on board with this whole thing.
Sure. Well, I mean, The Boyfriend is unusual in that it portrays pretty positive relationships. I mean, the happiness of the love story that goes well, or the joy of, Tommy Tune finding his father. Like,
I was waiting for you to mention. I know you love him.
I love Tommy Tune. I find it very sad that he only ever made 2 movies, because I guess there's no real pull for someone who's 6'6" who dances, who's just like got a real Texas accent. Like, that's a kind of unusual thing to put in a movie. So I love him. But, that is such a charming movie about people finding their happiness, finding their success. Maisie is going to do whatever Maisie does. Poor Maisie. She's the only real antagonist. But, there's such joy there. And in most of Ken Russell's other movies, marriages and relationships are pretty complicated. They're pretty painful and difficult. Even you could argue the marriage and the Devils. I mean, technically they want to be together, but the church won't allow it. So, there's always going to be some push-pull, some kind of prickliness, something that goes wrong. So
Well, and the best couple that I loved and adored, he kills them in Women in Love. So I was like, oh, this is how he feels about, we're just gonna like doom the long lost lovers or the people who are actually happy. So I agree with you. And the music lovers is definitely where like they had no chance even going in, but she just tries so hard, Jetta. Like she's
well, sometimes delusion is strong. We know that. But this actually brings up an interesting point in terms of talking about his historical accuracy or the lack thereof, or what his intentions were. There is a wonderful section of his autobiography where he goes to the Tchaikovsky Museum and he has a tour guide there, and the tour guide knows who Ken Russell is, and he's just seen the movie. I guess this was the early 70s. And Ken gets into such an argument with this person, if I may, the guide. How can scandal help us appreciate the work of a great artist? Ken responds, hey, the music lovers turned a lot of people onto Tchaikovsky. If I hadn't told United Artists that it was the story about a homosexual who fell in love with a nymphomaniac, it might never have been financed. And one of our greatest composers would have still been resting peacefully in his grave. This tour guide is very offended. It goes on. You hate Tchaikovsky. No, Ken says, I love him, but my love isn't blind. You telescope events and characters. You turn his life into a frenzied carnival, all highs and lows, no moments of reflection or tranquility. Ken says, there's as much tranquility in my film on Tchaikovsky as there is in his music. But how can you hope to do justice to a man's life in 2 hours? Ken thinks, well, Tchaikovsky condensed his whole life into the Symphonie Pathétique. He said so himself, and that runs for less than an hour. Oh, that's a work of art. Your film is commercial bombast devoid of fact. You use only the facts that suit you. Ken says, every note of his music is a fact, and every bar of his music is open to a different interpretation. He says in response, you have denigrated a great Russian hero. This is where Ken gets really angry. Great heroes, he says, are the stuff of myth and legend, not facts. Facts are for computers. I'm a myth maker. Then they both shut up. They get angry at each other. They're staring. People are staring. Ken's very frustrated because this man's never going to change his point of view. His ultimate point is, I would never abandon my passionate flights of imagination. And imagination is what you need to see Peter Tchaikovsky played by Dr. Kildare, which was, of course, Richard Chamberlain's famous role at the time. So I think he was so much less interested in note by note, well, not to make a joke of it, but, he wanted less to take fact and history as it was, as to reinterpret it according to the themes that were interesting to him, and to figure out, how can I tell this story in a way that feels true to the core of what is important, but is not necessarily, I don't know, exactly
100% accurate.
Right. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be drawn from the pages of a biography, but these are the things interesting to me. This is what I think the audience could respond to. This is what will be interesting for the actors to play, because I think he's thinking of, what will the actors be able to give me? What can I expect them to be able to perform? What can they draw from? So there's a lot more going on there than just paying homage to a hero and only saying what would be kind and polite. So, that offended people terribly. But I think that's a wonderful aspect of what Ken can do as a filmmaker. Myth is important to him, storytelling, being an artist.
It's literally what Ridley Scott said. Like, the quote that I shared for him was like, I'm not a documentarian. I make movies. And if you watch Napoleon, you will know that he is not, it's not about like, although I think I think there's a balance here. I think he infuses history and context, but then he also just focuses on whatever he wants, and whatever he's most interested in is what is you're going to see. So the movie Napoleon is actually far less about war than it is about he and his wife. It's literally almost entirely about their unhealthy relationship, because that's what fascinated him. With Ken, I think it's the same thing, where music lovers, I felt, because the music is so intense, making the characters so intense wasn't strange to me. If the music had been like Bach, or, more morose, like Chopin, I think that it would have felt very different. But Tchaikovsky is like, so,
there's a richness, there's a Ken Russell-esque quality to it, I think.
There really is. Yeah. So when the characters are going crazy and that music is in the background, it feels like that music should be the score to that event.
Sure. And I think that, also to some extent it has to do with how you respond personally to the story being told. If you are interested in that kind of complicated relationship, which not all his movies are about so intensely, sometimes there's a lot more going on than just the focus on those two characters in that relationship. You might gravitate more towards that than, say, Listomania, where it's got so much more going on than just the marriages, which are also not great. So, it depends on how you appreciate the mode in which it's being told.
I think also that there's that common theme of like that the women are very almost aggressively trying to get their needs met, and the men are just completely inept at doing so.
Right.
So she really, even if he were straight, I don't think that she would have gotten the amount that she needed from him. Like, It really was, to me, it wasn't, I know that he said it's about a homosexual in love with a nymphomaniac. I didn't see either of them as those being the deal breaker. I saw it as like, they could not meet each other's needs and they were not right for each other in that regard. And they were never going to be, no matter what.
And that comes up a lot in his movies. I mean, if you think also about Crimes of Passion, the marriage in that movie. Those two people were not right for each other, and they probably never should have been married. They never should have stayed married, and yet they did until a breaking point. So that comes up a lot, and I do think that that is rooted in Ken Russell's own childhood, because he felt like his parents didn't show very much love in their house. There was just... they loved him, but it was never really shown. It was all very... kept quiet. They're just not very demonstrative people. He had a different relationship with his parents when they grew older, specifically his mother, because I think she went through dementia, and so she would begin to say things, and they may have been inappropriate to him. He was embarrassed. They were very deeply personal things about her marriage. So he had a different relationship to her as she aged, but as a child, I think he felt like he was looking for something. He was looking for an affection. And he also wanted to push boundaries. He also, there's an interesting section about being at an all-boys nautical academy, because his father was in that kind of world. I think he was a shipmaker or something that had to do with marine life. But at this school, Ken directed his first ever stage show, and it was an all-boys musical, the first ever drag show that was ever done there, because they couldn't do anything else.
Of course.
And of course, this was controversial, and there's all this kind of fascinating, kind of gender-bending sort of aspect to where the boys really turned on. Like, they were just so interested in this, like, getting dressed up in women's clothes. And so he always wanted to push boundaries. He was looking for happiness. He was looking for fulfillment. He had a lot of really weird and interesting relationships. A lot of it has to do with his first marriage to Shirley, the costume designer. That was not a great marriage. It lasted 20 years, but the impression I got was that they really shouldn't have gotten married when they did. Maybe they rushed into it. Maybe they were happy at the start, but it didn't last. A lot of it has to do with the fact that she was at home taking care of their 5 children while he was establishing his directing career. And I'm not sure to what degree he appreciated that. He had some flings with actresses. And then he gets very, very mad at her because she does like a tit-for-tat thing with his chauffeur on the set of The Devils. And he's like, how could she do that to me? Well,
okay. We're getting into, yeah.
Yeah, and then he does that back again by falling in love with the woman who would become his second wife, Vivian, who eventually ended up writing Salome's Last Dance and The Rainbow with him. Right. That is a fascinating story, too, because there's a lot of time spent in his autobiography on Valentino, because that's where the affair started. And Shirley gets extremely angry because she's the costume designer on that set, and Ken is literally like having dinner with Vivian every night. And he's like, why does she think something is happening here? Ken, Jetta. Have a little perspective, please.
Maybe he so saw himself in these guys, like, because Dante's Inferno and Music Lovers are like, they're very, you wrote about this in your Dante's Inferno review, which I thought was so spot on, that they're looking for something in a woman that they think will like fulfill them, like the ideation of that and the romanticization. And you even said this in For the Rainbow, where it was like, the actress, what's her name from the Lair of the White Worm?
Sammy Davis.
Yeah, she says that, like, you're an idea. Like, you can have men's passion, but they're
Amanda Donahoe, yes.
Amanda Donahoe, thank you. Yeah. That she's saying, like, you can only get so much because of this tendency to want more from a woman as an idea than as a person. Mm-hmm. So I think that theme is constant, because even in Music Lovers, he keeps thinking of his mother, and he's like, my mother was the only woman that I've ever loved. And it's the same thing where it's like, do they love them for who the women are, or just what they fulfill that the man, the character, thinks that he's lacking? I think that's constant in all of his films.
Sure, yeah. And there is also kind of a bittersweetness to reading the autobiography, because he sees Vivian as this new chapter in his life. His life is starting over. Oh my God, the number of times he describes himself being with Shirley as like being a cuckold. Like, okay, like he's starting over. He's finding something new. But then they got divorced the year the book came out. So, like, that marriage to Vivian did not last. He ended up getting married 4 times. And supposedly his wives eventually, I don't know how long it took to repair things with Shirley, but they eventually all were able to talk to each other again, because there is a photo from sometime in the early 2000s where he's at some retrospective and all 4 of his wives are there. So clearly they were able to reach some understanding at some point and forgive each other, forgive him, whatever. But it is just interesting as part of the artistic temperament to think that he couldn't necessarily control his emotions, he couldn't necessarily control his impulses, and then he would get mad at other people for doing the same thing. But then he also couldn't blame Shirley, because he felt that The Devils was such a difficult shoot. It was full of so much torture and pain. He was like, yeah, I guess actually I can't fault her for wanting to run into the arms of someone who was not crazy. So, he has some ability to reflect. But
well, and I read when he did Altered States that he was at the height of his alcoholism. So this person is like behaving there's major addict energy, addict tendencies, and just not being able to fill whatever it is, and just searching. It's almost obsessive the way that it feels. I felt that way in Valentino too, where even though that was a little bit more tame compared to the other ones, it's like that search is so strong and I think Valentino at least was a character that didn't seem to have that. Like, he seemed okay, more or less, with himself, and he seemed more anchored. It was the people around him that wanted more from him, but he at least seemed a little bit more solid. Whereas like Crimes of Passion, oh my gosh, Anthony Perkins.
Well, I think there's a question. Oh, wow, that's a whole other thing. Ken Russell really loved Anthony Perkins. He was just delighted by him, thought he was just the nicest person, the most professional, respectful, dedicated actor. That warms my heart. I like
the character, though, Jetta. Oh, my gosh.
Well, yes, but Anthony Perkins was so devoted. There's actually a great quote here. His devotion to the role. Let's see.
Can you describe this just really briefly, just in case nobody knows anything that we're talking about? Because I feel like this is an important point. Because Perkins is so against type in Crimes of Passion. It's jarring how against type he is, to me.
I mean, he is against type and not, because, I mean, he did have at that point, because, considering the movie came out in 1984, he had a pretty long history of playing psychos. He had a long history of playing people with extremely complicated psychologies and extremely complicated sexualities. And of course, there is this long-standing question of, to what extent was Anthony Perkins struggling with his sexuality? Was he comfortable with it? Could he do what he did on screen without second-guessing it? There's a lot of layers to that. So the fact that he loved this role, what I have read in the past, I think the last time I reviewed Crimes of Passion, was that he really worked with the screenwriter, Barry Sandler, on crafting the character and changing things that he felt needed to be changed, and really giving more of his input as an actor, which I think Ken Russell really appreciated. By contrast, he did not love Kathleen Turner quite so much. He felt like she was really cold. Like, she was professional and she did what she needed to do in the role, but offset she was not really friendly, and he also doubted she could even do it, because apparently he had never seen Body Heat. Like, he met her and he thought she was so mousy, because he didn't know anything about her. He's always claiming in his book he's never seen this, he doesn't know that, what's this person done? Someone had to take him to see The Man with Two Brains to convince him that she could be sexy, which is just fascinating. He wasn't convinced she could do it, but I will say, I will read this. So in the movie, Kathleen Turner, And again, there are a lot of psycho illusions here, a lot about doubling, a lot about different roles, your public face, your private face, what's being hidden behind a mask of, the veneer of respectability, and what are you actually letting out when nobody's looking or when it's more acceptable to do so. I would like to say, for Crimes of Passion, Ken Russell felt that Anthony Perkins was a real prince of a man, as happy playing Shakespeare as Psycho, one of the most dedicated actors I've ever worked with, and took his role more seriously than anyone I know, to the extent of taking it home to bed with him, knowing that a minister of the gutter, because he is this preacher who, is simultaneously repulsed by Kathleen Turner's character, who is moonlighting as a sex worker. He's repulsed by her, but he also wants her. There's this, constant battle of what he really truly wants. He really wants to kill her ultimately. But
it feels very Wise Blood to me,
yes,
for what it's worth.
Again, like church and state, sex and violence, like he loves
Flannery
those.
O'Connor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Ken Russell said, knowing that a minister of the gutter would inevitably sleep rough, Perkins kept in his costume and even made and decorated his own props, including a small folding ladder he used as a sidewalk pulpit, which he painstakingly covered in pictures of saints and angels and pornographic cutouts from girly mags. Over the 6 weeks we worked on that non-union film with its endearing crew of dropouts, druggies, has-beens, and hope-to-be's, we struck up a close friendship, discussing everything from Mahler to my forthcoming marriage, because he hadn't actually officially married Vivian until 1983, I think. So I love that. That is so delightful. Just thinking that Anthony Perkins played such a difficult, complicated, exhausting character, but he was such a nice person. He was so sweet.
And just very dedicated.
Yeah.
I think that this goes back to perhaps the liking the all outness, when actors just go all out and they seem so dedicated and so on board with what's being asked of them. I think even if you don't like the movie, it seems like that's something you still respect highly. Yeah. Like Turbulence, even though you like that movie. But that's what always comes to my mind with you, where I'm like, Jetta loves when people are like, okay, I'm going for it. And then they really do. And they do a good job when they do.
Yeah. And even when there's a clash on the set, like some of the interesting tendencies that Ken Russell had in his movies was to work with people who were not necessarily trained actors. Maybe they were new. Maybe there were people who didn't work in that sphere of the arts. Roger Daltrey, obviously not a trained actor. You could argue that he's really more accustomed or more better suited to doing Tommy than Listomania, because in Tommy he doesn't really have to do anything. He sings. That's pretty much the extent of what his performance requires. There's not a whole lot of emoting. So, whether or not that makes him a good actor or a good performer or the right fit for the role, that's what Ken Russell wanted. That's what he was going to get by working with The Who. And so there's an interesting quality to how does that work for the audience. Obviously, Ken Russell must have liked working with Daltrey if they did it again for Listomania, which is a role that actually requires some kind of performance. There's actually an acting component to it. But that's a good relationship, I would assume. It was not quite the same with Nureyev on Valentino, because again, Nureyev was a ballet dancer, no acting training. So the question is, how does his persona translate to the screen? How does his physicality translate to the screen? There was a clash on the set with, Nureyev wanted to do this, Russell wanted to do that. Russell was the experienced filmmaker. Nureyev had an ego as this great ballet star. The fact that he also had that heavy accent was a problem. So there were all these. And
he clashed with Michelle Phillips too.
Yes,
I read that they had like major problems where he just didn't know how to respond to her. And then that's another thing too that I appreciated I think in most of them, I would say that the chemistry was very good. That one was not so much. But in Women in Love and The Rainbow especially, I felt like the chemistry was there between the characters. I could believe that they were connected. Even in Savage Messiah too, you believe that the relationship, that they have a fondness towards one another. But Valentino definitely was not that.
But that's interesting also, because there are these multiple layers in Valentino where the history of Valentino is this history of questioning. People questioning his sexuality, questioning the validity of his marriages, questioning the women's sexualities. Did they really want to be married? Was it a quote-unquote lavender marriage for the sake of appearance in Hollywood? There is all this questioning. And the fact that there was Nureyev playing this role, when I think it was an open secret that he was not straight, even though he would never, ever discuss it, people knew. And so there's this incredible quote in the book where Ken is talking about how frustrating it is sometimes to work with Nureyev, and one of his colleagues says, yeah, that's the problem of hiring a guy who has the same name as your character, Rudy. Yeah, so I think there were difficulties on that set, and especially with clashing with Michelle Phillips, again, Mamas and the Papas, not a trained
not
actor.
An actress. Right.
But she was determined to be right for the role, and so they had to figure out how to make it work. But because there is a question of whether that marriage was legit, I guess.
Legit anyway.
There's a question of whether there should be more chemistry, and will that feel off if it is not true to the story? Then, of course, there's the question of, is he even trying to be historically accurate? He's kind of just doing his own thing. Valentino did not do that boxing bout. Like, I don't think that was how he died. Or if he did do that, that wasn't what killed him. So, there is this question of what's real, what's not, what's going to be effective for the story, what's going to make it feel like a statement at the end. Because that is a powerful part of the movie. I think that boxing section is pretty impactful. So
right. That's why you can always tell that it's a Ken Russell film, because no matter how polished it looks at the beginning, then you've got like the prison scene in Valentino, and I was like, okay, he can't help himself. Like he puts his interests in there, and he makes it so that you're like, it can't just be pure, whatever it is. That's maybe why I liked Altered States, actually, because I felt like Altered States was more a vision of someone else's, and then Ken was able to do it justice. Like, it didn't feel like it was his vision, but it felt like he was being extremely devoted to producing someone's vision. And he did say that he like stuck to the lines. He hardly put anything in there that he himself wrote. He was trying to be very faithful, and I think that he did an excellent job. So I respect that he did that. And then I just liked the movie.
And then I would argue that's also why you respond so strongly to Women in Love, because that was a Larry Kramer project. He was the person who bought the rights to Lawrence's novel. Russell admits when he was given the project, he didn't even know who D.H. Lawrence was. He assumed that the studio was referring to T.E. Lawrence, like it'd be a Lawrence of Arabia sequel. So he had to be informed, because I think he was not to say that he wasn't an intellect is not really fair, because obviously he was obsessed with classical music. He had certain interests that were extremely important to him that he was passionate about. But I think perhaps he did not come from a literary background. He has a lot of chips on his shoulders, both of them, about the fact that he grew up lower middle class, that he was never considered good enough by the boys in his school who bullied him. He didn't have the right accent. He didn't have the right education. So I think it probably annoyed him that he was given this project and, he had to read the book, and he thought Lawrence is so overrated, but he'll do it. He'll figure out how to work with it. And it's really, I think, more of Kramer's voice as a screenwriter, adapting Lawrence and knowing what to put in there. But Russell makes it more his own. I think still fairly restrained, but it works because of that, because he's figuring out, it's him finding his footing as a director. It's one of his first major feature films. So there's a process there where he's still figuring out what to do. But I appreciate that there is that collaboration going on.
I agree. And I think that he actually does well in collaboration, even when he doesn't get along with the person. I think that he has a sense of understanding, a depth of understanding of material that isn't his, because a lot of these he's doing movies of things that already existed, whether it's a person or a piece of music or a novel. Like, I don't know if any of his films are purely, he had this original idea and none of it had existed prior.
I don't know. That doesn't sound, I think they are all either literary adaptations or another screenwriter coming to him. I don't think he ever did his own pure. I don't think so. So that is interesting. He obviously enjoyed being a student of history. He enjoyed learning. I think he felt like he knew enough about the history of, say, the Devils to want to tackle that. So, I appreciate that he was constantly learning. He was constantly trying to improve himself and to thereby teach the audience. So even though he didn't necessarily have what I think he might have considered a snobbish pedigree, like some of his contemporaries might have had, he was trying his best to put his own original thought and his own voice into existing material, I guess.
Yeah, because a lot of it existed prior and then he adapted it, or it's almost like, it reminds me of that line in Savage Messiah where she finds him in the basement and she's like, a forger. And he's like, well, like he's an excellent forger. Maybe Ken, to a certain extent, saw himself as not a forger exactly, but as someone who could paint very, very well, but he needed a model. He didn't just paint from his own creation. It's like he looked at something and then he knew what to do to give it justice, as opposed to someone who just looks at a block of marble and then sculpts. I think that he needed some sort of outside inspiration of himself, and then he knew what to do.
And I think he also felt like he had something to prove, because an interesting point is that he studied ballet, so he actually did have dance training. That didn't end up working out. He also tried acting, and that didn't work out. But he always had this desire to tell stories, so I think he had to figure out in what form and fashion he could do that. And even when he tried to get into TV directing, which he did for a while, it was still kind of complicated and difficult because he had all these ideas, this creativity, but people in charge would tell him, no, you really can't do that. If it's a documentary or if it's a mostly nonfiction retelling of something, but with some actors peppered in here and there to, stand in, but it's not really a biopic, you can't have them doing too much acting. You can't have them doing too much to make people think, oh, did he really do this? Maybe you're not being historically accurate. So he was always struggling, I think, to find what's the right way for me to be in the arts. How can I do this and be successful at it? And when he finally was able to get into feature filmmaking, albeit with some difficulties, because his first film, French Dressing, I gather that didn't work out too well. Then he did $1 Billion Brain, which was a spy movie, basically like another James Bond, and that wasn't great. He had to figure out what to do. He had to figure out, how am I going to tell stories? What's going to be effective? And so I think this also reminds me of a great little detail. Do you remember? Because I know you've seen The Russia House.
Do you remember I did that with Draper.
Yes. Do you remember that Ken Russell was in that?
No.
Yeah.
Was he one of the men behind the desk, like when they went in the maybe not.
So I don't remember because I haven't seen the movie. I don't remember which character he played.
I might have known this, and if I do remember this, I'm almost positive he's in that room when they're like the politicians. Andrew would know this, but yeah, I think I might know that.
So one thing is, he couldn't believe that he was being asked to do this because I'm not an actor. I can't do this. Maybe they're thinking of Kurt Russell. Maybe they were. But he also was mildly amused, maybe not offended, but I think he always felt like he had something to prove, because one of the reasons why apparently he was asked to do this movie was people thought he was gay. They thought he might be gay. They weren't sure of his sexuality. They thought that he had tendencies, even if he said that he wasn't. And so I think he always felt like, I've got to have something to prove. I've got to make it clear who I am, what I stand for. I don't think he was really offended by that. I think he thought, it's fine, whatever. But he still had this baked in feeling of, I've got to be Ken Russell for whatever that's worth, and people have to know what that means. And that's like a constant question. It's evolving over the course of his career.
Well, and I hate to bring up something that's completely unrelated, but I think you will appreciate this. I watched Pumping Iron last night.
Oh, I want to know what you think of that.
Well, okay, but here it's relevant in as much as one of the things that I thought of that really struck me was the difference between Arnold Schwarzenegger and Lou Ferrigno, because Arnold seems to me, and this isn't just because he's confident, you might even say like cocky. I mean, he's really quite arrogant. But at the same time, the difference between the two of them is that Arnold does not have what you're describing. He does not have a chip on his shoulder. He truly believes that, like, he loves so much what he's doing and he wants to do it to the best of his ability. And he has so much passion for it. It's not about proving anything. Whereas Lou, poor Lou, he and his dad were constantly talking about how he was trying to prove himself, how he really wanted to beat Arnold, how when he was young, he had an ear infection and then he couldn't hear until he was 3 years old. And then they finally fixed it. But and then I think he was bullied too. So those are two very different things. And I think they manifest in different ways when it comes to competition or when it comes to creation, because you're operating like the trying to prove yourself is kind of operating out of a negative space, whereas Arnold always seemed to be coming out of a positive, life-affirming space. And I think maybe that's partly why he was so good, because his mental health was just kind of ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about the fact that in so many Ken Russell movies, it's about proving masculinity, specifically heteromasculinity. Like, what does it mean to be a man for Savage Messiah, or for The Music Lovers, or for Women in Love, Listomania, Crimes of Passion? Like, it keeps happening over and over. And You're right. I think there is a lot of Ken Russell in that question. Valentino. It's like, what does it mean to be a man in this world, in this specific story or at large? How do you comport yourself? How do you present yourself? And Ken Russell was considered very flamboyant. He was considered so over the top. He says a lot in his book. He's really not like that. He's really very quiet and mild-mannered. He likes to go home. He doesn't like wild parties. I think he had certain tendencies on his sets. He was thought of as a dictator, like a martinet, because he had such a strong vision. And sometimes he clashed with people and got into big arguments. But he didn't think of himself as a wild person. So there's also this push-pull between what people perceived and what was actually true. And even within that, there can be contrasts. So he was a complicated person, and that is definitely reflected in the relationships on film and the characters and whether or not you think they're effective or what they're even trying to convey.
So to wrap this up, Jet.
But there's so many more quotes I have.
Jetta, I'll let you share one more.
Okay. One? Oh, could I share two more?
Okay.
Okay. So I
don't even know why you ask.
Well, I had to. I wanted to share, let's see. Do you want to hear about his acid trip when he was doing Altered States?
Oh, gosh. Yes, please.
So, as our journey continued through the night sky and layer upon angled layer of these elegant shapes, I had the sensation of passing through a new dimension into a hot and trackless desert, where a writhing cloud snaked over the sand dunes from horizon to horizon. As we got closer, I was able to see through the rising dust the form of a great serpent, the lair of the white worm, with no head and no tail. It was endless. And as we got closer still, I was able to see through the skin to its skeleton, moving slowly, rhythmically forward. This goes on and on for a long time, but essentially, blah, 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 this great collective soul was protecting us, sustaining us and blessing us until the moment of our death, when we would become part of it ourselves. It was a revelation. I was in ecstasy, and I wanted it to last forever, but already the cloud of dust was stirred up by the stamping feet, getting thicker, obscuring my vision, and filling me with a great sense of loss. That's kind of sad, isn't it? But he has this gigantic, whole thing about the ode to joy and the snake encompassing the face of the earth, and it goes on and on. But I think that is just so fascinating. He remembered every single detail of this incredible experience that he wanted to have happen again, but then he thought, oh no, what if it happens again and I can't get out of it and I'm stuck in this acid trip forever? Which is a little bit much.
Which is kind of the point of Altered States. I also want to posit, too, before we conclude, that Altered States has my favorite ending of any of his films. And I think that it's very hopeful. And it's like coming to the end of his utter self-involvement. But I love that ending. And I think that's part of the reason why it resonates so much with me, because she really, I find it very moving when people stick with someone no matter what they do. And she just fights so hard for him, and she loves him so much. And then finally at the end, he's like, I love you and I see you. Like he could see her because she came to his area. You know what I mean? Like she believed what he said.
I didn't think that they should have done that. That's the problem.
Oh, okay. Well, I love the ending, and I think it's very happy.
Well, but that also, of course, brings up the fact that he had a very complicated relationship to faith. He said, essentially, because he had converted to Roman Catholicism when he got married to Shirley, and the Devils basically broke his sense of faith, at least in terms of a church. He still believed in music as a religion. He believed in the power of poetry. He believed in the arts, basically, as the thing that could sustain him and give him inspiration and meaning. So, like Wordsworth or, Coleridge. But as far as...
Or Mary Shelley.
Yeah, as far as literature and poetry, but the Devils basically convinced him, I do not believe in a god as such anymore. So that's interesting in terms of Altered States being having faith, having belief, having trust. You could argue that he still had that with marriage because he still kept doing it. But as far as belief in a higher power, that's more complicated for him. But what I did want to mention once, just to wrap up, this is him talking about, it's rumination on his father being 80 years old, in very poor health, nearing the end of his life. Ken says, I rarely have dreams of death, but when I do, they are generally very gothic affairs lit by flickering candles and steeped in ritual. I am the victim, moving slowly in chains through the shadows, through the scaffold, and the inevitable moment of execution, either by axe or noose. It is always night, and I always escape through an exploding maelstrom of fire. The land of my dreams is fraught with anxiety. My house is a desolate shell. Rain falls through shattered tiles. The roof is a gaping hole. Floors have collapsed. Plaster crumbles. I stand in the hallway on a pile of damp rubble, sprouting bramble and thistle, surrounded by a group of wet, silent faces. Are they workmen gathered around to help resurrect the dying property? Or plainclothesmen looking for a corpse that may be hidden under the rotting floorboards? Can the house be saved? Will the corpse be found if indeed there is a corpse? Something is coming through the doorway behind me. It is a naked woman riding on the back of a giant crab. Jetta. That's enough. Other people's dreams are so boring. Don't you love that he would include that in his book?
I love that that's the way that you wanted to end this episode.
Yeah, other people's dreams are so boring. His aren't.
Okay, last question. If you could recommend one Ken Russell movie to someone who has never seen any of them, which one would you recommend?
Well, the one that I think of as being crucial for me, because it was not the first movie I had seen. As established, I'd seen The Boyfriend as a kid, but the first one I saw where I really knew this was a Ken Russell movie, and I know what that means, was when I saw Tommy. So when I was 14 and a half and I discovered the magic of The Who, and I realized I wanted to listen to the album Tommy and then discover the movie, that was my way of getting to understand what does it mean for Ken Russell to make a movie? What does it mean for his distinct auteur style, his artistic stamp to be on a movie that is already so infused with The Who, and it's already all about their storytelling and what they think Tommy is about, but Ken is using his distinct way of using visuals and using music, because of course music is such an important part of his movie making, specifically classical throughout the course of his career, but because by his own admission, he hated rock. Like, he did not get it. He was such an old fogey when it came to rock music and anything. Because I guess being born in 1927 and being too old for, the Beatlemania era, even though that's really what Listomania is copying,
yes.
He felt like he didn't get it. And so it really meant something for him to enjoy doing something like Tommy, which of course also brings up that amazing point of Elton John wanting to be in the rainbow and like that whole thing that we didn't even get into.
I'm so glad it wasn't. It was my Deep Red Man. Yeah, I was like, no. That would not have worked.
Also hilarious because, again, a thing that Ken Russell insisted he didn't know about. He claimed, wow, David Hemmings hasn't done anything since Blow Up. Guess he didn't see Deep Red.
Gosh, it's so good.
Yeah,
I almost rewatched that last night. Okay,
but
so
Tommy is important. I think Tommy was my real introduction at that age, being a teenager, old enough to get it, old enough to realize, like the tagline says, your senses will never be the same, which is a perfect way to describe Ken Russell overall. And of course, Anne Margaret. I think that was what showed me that he could direct performances that were incredible. I don't think he ever directed a better performance than Anne Margaret rolling in that champagne and those baked beans. That is just worth the Oscar nomination.
I honestly can't believe that that's not just your avatar, because that's like, to me, that just sums it all up. And her talk about somebody who is all in and willing to go out there, like she jumps off the cliff, and it is something to see. It is a sight to behold.
Her or Kathleen Turner in Crimes of Passion, I always respond to those kinds of, or Oliver Reed in The Devils. I think any of those performances that show the actor is so committed and so willing to do it, whether they loved working with Ken or not, that kind of commitment, both from him as a director and from the actors to put it all together. I think Tommy is what I would suggest, even if you don't have the context of the music, because you thought Tommy was interesting. You didn't rate it, but you did think it was worth seeing.
I was glued to the screen, and I, partly because of Anne Margaret and Oliver Reed, and then also I just, the whole thing about the child, it's just, it almost feels biblical to me. Maybe that's why I was able, because it seems like a fable.
It is. He's a savior. And what does it mean to be a prophet? What does it mean for people to exploit that?
Exactly.
Again, exploitation is a big part of his movies. Yeah.
Right. I don't know. It felt, even though it was wildly crazy, unknown territory, it felt somewhat familiar to me, oddly. Yeah. And that's why I kind of grasped. I felt like I understood at least what he was saying or the themes that he was exploring. So I wasn't just like completely lost to it.
I think that's probably the best way you could sell the Ken Russell experience, that even if you don't know what to rate it, even if you don't know how to assess it or what to approach it, like what framework within to see it, you can still enjoy it and find it entertaining. And that's the gateway drug. Like that is what'll get you into the rest of his work.
Perfect. Well, Jetta, we have another episode under our belt. And thank you so much for doing this. I will never forget this experience.
I'm sure I will then think of a million other things I could have said and be like, oh my God, why didn't I talk about the dream sequence from The Lair of the White Worm?
This is wonderful. I appreciate all the excerpts. Always so much fun. And it's been my pleasure, and we'll see you at the movies. Bye.